We're going live now to our committed coverage of the U.S. Senate and further debate today on congressional insider trading.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend Dr. Joseph Vogt, Senior Pastor of Community Lutheran Church in Sterling, Virginia.
Let us pray. God of grace and glory, in whom all righteousness, peace, and goodness are found, you have created us in your image, given us a world of good gifts, and the blessing of this land we call home. Send your spirit of wisdom, discernment, and grace to these elected servants. Take away any fear or prejudice that may keep them from civil discourse, goodwill, and mutual endeavor. Remind them of their calling to serve and inspire them to make decisions which promote the common good, ensure justice and liberty for all, and make this nation a beacon of hope for the world. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 2, 2012. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Following the Leader remarks, the Senate will be in period of morning business till 11 this morning. The majority will control the first half, the Republicans the second half. Following that morning business, we'll resume consideration of the Stock Act. Mr. President, we've worked very hard until late in the evening last night to try to come up with agreement to complete action on this bill. We'll notify senators when those votes are scheduled. We hope that can be done. Will the chair announce the business for the day?
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, there will now be a period of morning business until 11 a.m. with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, over the last several months, I put my staff on a little mission, and I asked them to identify manufacturing companies in my home state of Illinois that have not only weathered this recession but are doing well and are hiring. I wanted to meet with these companies and find out why the recession has treated them differently, particularly when it comes to manufacturing jobs. I have been pleasantly surprised at how many businesses I have found to be in that condition in my state. Not to understate our unemployment rate or the impact of the recession on many businesses, the fact is there are some that have not only weathered the storm but are doing quite well. And they represent a variety of different things that they manufacture. The heartening and encouraging news is that we're hearing more often that companies have decided to resource their jobs back to the United States. The President, in his State of the Union address, spoke of one such company, Master Lock, located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which he noted is now announced they think America is the best place to do business, to make products and do business. That is a good trend which we want to encourage. We know that we've lost a goodly share of manufacturing jobs over the last several years. In the year 2000, more than 17 million Americans were employed in manufacturing. 10 years later, the number had fallen to 11.5 million, from 17 million to 11.5 million. More than 300 of those jobs were lost in my home state of Illinois in that decade from 2000 to 2010. But American manufacturing is growing again. One of the real good news stories is Chrysler. I'm sure the President remembers the controversy when General Motors and Chrysler faced bankruptcy and the possibility of literally going out of business. In my lifetime, other car manufacturers have gone out of business. The President decided, and rightly so, that we couldn't afford to lose those jobs. And so we engineered a loan with General Motors and Chrysler premised on their changing the way they did business. And many critics said that was the wrong thing to do. The capitalist purists were saying, no, these things happen. Companies go away and new companies emerge. General Motors and Chrysler should be allowed to go gently into the night. President Obama disagreed, many of us disagreed, and he put a down payment on the future of the American automobile industry, which has paid off handsomely. Just this last week, the major auto manufacturers, Ford, Chrysler, announced record-breaking profits. They have restructured, they are selling a better product, and they're doing it in a better way, and they are now competitive, and the American people are buying their products. General Motors has come back strong. Just by way of comparison, I recently read that if you look at the total number of employees in certain companies, it gives you an idea why some have more value overall to the economy than others. We all know Facebook. We hear about it all the time. I laughingly say when somebody asks to take my picture, do you promise you'll put it on Facebook? And they laugh out loud because that's exactly what they're going to do instantaneously. Facebook has about 3,000 employees in America. We all know Google. We use it every day. I do, to find information and to access different sites. Google has about 30,000 employees in the United States. How many employees in General Motors direct employment? 100,000. 100,000. So when the President said we need to invest in the automobile industry, it was a decision based on the need for good-paying jobs right here in America. Well, I can tell you when it comes to Chrysler, it was an investment that paid off for my home state of Illinois. This week, Chrysler is announcing that it will be adding 1,600 manufacturing jobs at its plant in Belvidere, Illinois. I was encouraged when I met with the CEO of Chrysler, and he said it's one of the most efficient and cost-productive plants in all of Chrysler Corporation, and it should be expanded. In November, Caterpillar, the largest exporter in my state, largest manufacturer, announced a $600 million investment in its plants in Decatur, Illinois, and Peoria, going to bring back hundreds of jobs to our area. American companies are beginning to realize that manufacturing products right here in the United States can be profitable again. Good news for Illinois and good news for America. Manufacturing was the backbone of the American economy for decades, and we may never see it return to its heyday, but we should take steps to strengthen it. In the State of the Union address, President Obama laid out a number of key steps to boost manufacturing and ensure that more products have those three key words, made in America. The President's proposal builds on legislation that I introduced personally in 2010 to reduce the tax benefits that companies can claim when they close factories here in the United States. Hard as it may be to believe, the tax code rewards and compensates those companies that decide to close down manufacturing in the United States and move it overseas. The tax code currently allows companies moving operations overseas to deduct their moving expenses and reduce their taxes in the United States as a result. It's a direct subsidy to move the job overseas. It's just common sense taxpayers shouldn't be helping companies cover the cost of outsourcing jobs. The President also is taking important steps to encourage insourcing when companies close operations overseas and move jobs back to the United States. Specifically, the President is calling for a 20% income tax credit for the expenses of moving operations back into the United States to help companies bring jobs home. He also proposed a new credit for investments that help finance projects in communities that have suffered a major job loss event, and every one of our states has one. It might be the steel mill in Hennepin, Illinois, the tool manufacturers in Sterling Rock Falls, the appliance factory in Galesburg, or the farm equipment factory in Canton, Illinois. Too many communities have suffered dramatic layoffs when plants have shut down over the last several decades. We have all seen the stories. We have all met the people who have seen their lives change dramatically because of those decisions. Without new investment, many of these communities will continue to struggle. This tide is starting to turn for American manufacturing, but we can do more to make growth in that sector stronger and faster. We may never return to the 40s and 50s, but there are some things we can do. Mr. President, one of the things that I found interesting is I visited these plants that were trying to hire people in manufacturing, was the obstacles they were running into. Now, we have a state with a lot of unemployment. It's over 8%, and in some parts of our state, over 10%. And you wonder how in the world, with so many people out of work, you would have good-paying jobs go unfilled. And it turns out, I found, as I traveled around the state, those in manufacturing who want to hire new employees run into three obstacles. First obstacle, the person applying for the job does not have the skills necessary to work in manufacturing today. Those who haven't seen it personally may not know what manufacturing looks like today. Well, it's much different than the image of 30 or 40 years ago. The plants themselves are much cleaner operations, and most of them are computer-driven. Unlike the old days of the steam and dirt in every direction, those aren't the manufacturing plants in many instances across America today. And so what they're looking for in applicants for industrial maintenance, for example, which is a major area of need as baby boomers age out and retire, industrial maintenance requires that the applicant have more than a passing knowledge of mathematics and computers. And if they don't, then frankly they're walking into an environment where they can't be much help. So in some areas, in Danville, for example, local manufacturer, ThyssenKrupp, teaming up with the Danville Community College to try to take those who don't possess the right math and computer skills, train them at the expense of the company so they can go to work. The same thing is true all across my state. Over and over again, the community college links up with the manufacturing concern and starts training the employees so that they'll be ready to fill the jobs at the expense of the company. The second obstacle, it's a psychological obstacle, which I hadn't thought about. But it turns out that many parents, when the son says, listen, they're hiring out at such and such a business, the parent will say, wait a minute. I didn't want you to grow up working in a factory like your dad. You know, I wanted you to have a job where you wear a coat and tie. Didn't you go to community college and so forth? You ought to do better than that. Well, it turns out that there's a prejudice against working in factories, even though, as I said, they're much different, and their compensation in many instances is much better than some other alternatives. So what we're having is open houses at many of these factories around Illinois so that families and high school counselors can see what they look like, see that they're not the image that they might have in their mind. That's the second obstacle. The third obstacle is one that is very practical. Before you would put an employee in charge of a multi-million-dollar computer-driven manufacturing process, you want to make certain they're not only skilled, but sober. And that means drug test. Many of these would-be applicants for manufacturing jobs fail drug tests time and again. Why? They've grown up in a generation that says marijuana doesn't count, and they're wrong. Or they're engaged in other drugs. They just can't expect to be taken seriously as a job applicant if they can't pass a drug test. They'll never get through the front door. Those three things, basic skill and training, the attitude of families towards jobs in manufacturing, and the drug test turn out to be the three obstacles that have been raised time and time again all across my state of Illinois. We can overcome each and every one of them and should. And we can fill these jobs, good American jobs, with skilled set people who can produce for this country for many years to come. Mr. President, on another topic, I would like to note that this year's political campaigns are different than just 2 years ago. There's a dramatic infusion of money from so-called super PACs. Now we're starting to learn the identity of those who are behind it. Just yesterday there were some disclosures about the contributors. Many of the names are familiar, the same very wealthy people who have time and again been engaged in our political process. The new approach, of course, is that there's no limitation on what they can spend. And in addition to that, there's very little disclosure on a timely basis. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of them is a Supreme Court decision in Citizens United. It may be as flawed a decision as that court has ever made to equate corporations and special interest groups with average Americans when it comes to our political process, and to say that speech is money, money is speech, and to say basically there are no rules and no limits in terms of what a special interest group or corporation can spend in our political process. I cannot think of a more corrupting influence. We know that politics and campaigns have become more expensive in this country every year. Those of us who are engaged in this business have, over our political lifetime, seen a dramatic evolution in terms of how money is raised and spent. I can recall in my first race in 1982 for the U.S. House of Representatives, raising and spending what was then almost a record amount in a House race against an incumbent congressman of $800,000. It was a huge amount of money in those days, and as I said, I believe one of the most expensive congressional races to date. I waited, anxiously waiting for a $25,000 check from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They promised and promised and promised. It never showed up. But $25,000 was a big deal. Now, look where we are today. It is not unusual for candidates for Congress and the Senate to spend millions of dollars routinely in electing and re-electing members of the House of Representatives. On our side of the rotunda, just dramatically increase those numbers, and you'll see the basic political field we play on now when it comes to political campaigns. The Citizens United decision was a step in the wrong direction. It wasn't that long ago when two of our own, Republican John McCain and Democrat Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, teamed up to end soft money in politics and to try to bring down the infusion of money from outside interest. They took years to reach their goal, and finally when they did, after being challenged in court, they were picked away at over the years, and now with Citizens United they've been toppled completely. So now the field is wide open. Whether we're talking about the need to reduce the deficit, reform the tax code, create jobs, most everybody knows that different parties have different ideas. What many people don't know is that there are special interest groups which have their own agenda and their own ideas on these and so many other issues. It's just hard for presidential candidates and members of Congress to navigate through or around the special interests that have now become such an integral part of our campaigns. The major donors, and since Citizens United decision, major force in American politics. I believe the overwhelming majority of people serving in the House and Senate in both political parties are honest and hardworking. And I believe that they're guided by good intentions. But we are nonetheless stuck in a terrible, corrupting campaign financing system. That decision by the Supreme Court 2 years ago made our system so much worse that I think the only thing that can save it literally save it, so that our democracy is protected, is a dramatic change. After Citizens United, corporations and unions can spend as much money as they want to influence the presidential race, as well as congressional elections and the federal and state and local elections as well. In 2010, for the first time ever, spending on House and Senate races exceeded $1.6 billion. Outside groups spent 335% more on congressional campaigns than just 4 years earlier. Those numbers still look like a drop in the bucket compared to this year, this election cycle. The super PAC money is being used, as we've already seen in the Republican presidential primary, to fund negative, deceptive ads in support of candidates that are loosely, albeit not officially or formally, connected to those running super PACs. I think of the situation with former Speaker of the House Gingrich. One man and his wife have literally financed Gingrich's campaigns in 2 states, with $5 million contributions in each of those states, as I understand them. That, to me, is a corruption of this process. You can bet that big business isn't going to be shy about engaging in the Citizens United strategy of spending money to influence the outcome of elections. And you can bet it's going to have an impact on those of us who serve in the Senate and House. You know every single day as you vote that there is the potential of some special interest group out there deciding that is the breaking point. And from that point forward, they're going to do everything in their power to defeat you, and they can spend as much as they want to get the job done. It's a humbling, sobering reality since the Citizens United decision. Well, let me tell you, there's an alternative. One of them is a bill, or I should say a resolution, that's been offered by the presiding officer that I'm co-sponsoring, and that's a constitutional amendment that would basically reverse Citizens United. We know how uphill that struggle will be, but at least we have staked out a position to say we have got to overturn this decision. We have got to go back to the days of accountability and manageability when it comes to financing campaigns. I think that is a move in the right direction. I applaud the presiding officer, Senator from Arizona, for his leadership, Senator from New Mexico for his leadership on that issue. But there's another issue, too, and one that I think we should continue to bring up and discuss. It's called Fair Elections Now. The Fair Elections Now Act is a bill which I have introduced many Congresses. It would dramatically change the way congressional campaigns are funded. It would make super PACs irrelevant. The bill will allow candidates to focus on the needs of the people they represent, regardless of whether those people are wealthy, whether they donate to a super PAC, attend a fundraiser, or try to find special access to a candidate. Candidates in the fair election systems wouldn't need a dime from special interest lobbyists, not a penny, or corporations to run their campaigns. Under the system, qualified candidates for Congress, and to qualify, you would need to raise small contributions in volume in the state that you're running in. Those qualified candidates would receive grants, matching funds, and television broadcasting vouchers from the Fair Elections Fund to help them run the competitive campaigns. In return, candidates who voluntarily participate in the fair election system would agree to only accept campaign donations from small dollar donors in their state. We'd pay for the fund by asking businesses that earn more than $10 million a year in federal contracts to pay a fee of 0.5% with a maximum of $500,000 per year. That would fund it, and it would make certain that under the fair election system, we would have public financing and we would put it into this money chase that I believe is not only corrupting our campaign system, but could someday corrupt the very government that we are proud of and represent as elected officials. It is time to reform our system. I'm afraid, as I said at one gathering recently, if you're a student of history, it takes a massive scandal or a massive crisis to create a massive reform. I hope that that doesn't happen. I hope we have the good sense to move toward reform without that happening. But in the meantime, what is happening to our political system is not in the best interest of democracy. If the average person who is not wealthy cannot even consider the possibility of being a candidate for Congress, House, or Senate without the backing of huge special interest groups or without their own personal wealth, then we've lost something. A lot of us who got engaged in public life many years ago might never have considered it under today's rules because it is so expensive and so overwhelming. Any person who now steps up and says, I'm ready to run for Congress, I'm ready to run for the Senate, is introduced quickly to what's known as the power hour, dialing for dollars. You sit them down in a chair and you say, get on this phone and call this list and beg every person you can reach for at least $2,300, $2,500 and keep calling until the sun goes down and you start all over again tomorrow. There was a time when many of these candidates wouldn't be sitting talking to the wealthiest givers in America, but would be out in their states, in their district, talking to the people whose votes they are soliciting and whose needs they ought to appreciate. That time has changed, and we can change it back. We need to have the support of the American public and the political will in both political parties to achieve it. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate today will continue work on the Stock Act, the bill that would make it illegal for members of Congress and their staff to trade stocks based on non-public information. They're in morning business right now. General speeches up till about 11 o'clock Eastern, and they will resume with the Stock Act after that. Still, though, no agreement on how they're going to proceed on the dozen or more amendments that have been filed so far. There was an amendment debate yesterday, and likely amendment debate as well today on the Senate floor. The House is in today, but they won't start their legislative work until about noon, and when they come back, they'll take up a couple of bills dealing with the federal budget process, noon Eastern, and that's on C-SPAN. We're also covering several budget-related hearings today. Ben Bernanke is before the House Budget Committee with his 2012 Economic Outlook. That's live now on C-SPAN 3. And also Doug Elmendorf back on Capitol Hill today, this time before the Senate Budget Committee with the CBO's 2012 Outlook. You can follow that live. It's underway, and that's online at cspan.org.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask the quorum call be vitiated,
Without objection.
and I ask the President to let me know when I've finished, when I've used 10 minutes.
Chair will do so.
Thank you. Mr. President, last week we Republican senators had an extraordinary experience that millions of Americans have had and will have in the future. We spent a day at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, which is not more than about 40 minutes from the nation's capital. Even in the middle of winter, it's a beautiful, historic setting. It's hard to imagine why George Washington and Martha Washington would ever want to leave the place. Touring the rooms, we could imagine what life must have been like then. And there were many things that impressed us and that impress any of us when we visit there. One thing that especially impressed me was the fact that despite the beauty of the place and Washington's love for farming, he was gone from Mount Vernon for 8.5 years during the Revolutionary War. He never went home. He was always in the war. And even while he was President of the United States for 8 years, he was only at Mount Vernon 10 times during those 8 years. And after this presidency, of course, he soon died. So he gave up quite a bit to be the President of the United States. There were other things that impressed me about our visit to Mount Vernon. One was the reminder that our revolution was a revolution against a king. George Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, led a fight for independence from a king whom the signers of the Declaration of Independence stated had a, quote, history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over the states, unquote. Those were our revolutionary founders talking. And as president of the Philadelphia Convention, George Washington presided over the writing of the United States Constitution, which emphasizes, if it emphasizes any one word, the idea of liberty in creating the system of government that we enjoy today. And then there was another aspect to George Washington of which we were reminded, which would be good for us to think about today, and that was his modesty and restraint. George Washington must have had remarkable presence. He never had to say very much, apparently, to command the attention and respect of his countrymen. He likely could have been General of the Army as long as he wished and President of the United States as long as he wished. But he chose not to do that. It was he who first asked to be called simply Mr. President instead of some grand title. It was Washington who gave up his commission when the war was over. And it was Washington who stepped down after 2 terms and went home to Mount Vernon. In fact, that aspect of his character was imprinted upon the American character. That aspect of modesty and restraint on the part of the executive branch, and a recognition that our system depends absolutely on checks and balances. I'm struck by that attitude and the different attitude that I see in the administration of President Obama today, which has shown really disregard for those checks and balances and those limits on presidential power that our founders and George Washington felt were so important. This administration over 3 years has been arrogating more power to the executive branch of government and upsetting the delegate branch, which the founders created for the purpose of what? For the purpose of guaranteeing to each of us as individuals the maximum amount of liberty. I remember Senator Byrd saying time and time again that the purpose of the United States Senate, more than anything else, was a restraint upon the tyranny of the executive branch of government. That is our purpose as a Senate. This president's executive excesses are illustrated, and they were first, by the creation of more czars than the Romanovs had. Now, we've always had some so-called czars in the White House, the drug czar, for example. But now we have 3 dozen of them. And these czars duplicate and dilute responsibilities of cabinet members. They make it harder for the elected people, us, to have a supervisory role over exactly what they're doing. It's not only anti-democratic, it's a poor way to manage the government. And equally disturbing to me has been this administration's use of regulation and litigation to bypass the Congress and the will of the people when the Congress have a different point of view. For example, the President's appointees at the National Labor Relations Board in their decision in the Boeing case, which has now been apparently resolved, but which was an enormous abuse of power, in my opinion. And then the President is taking to blaming almost everyone for the problems that we see in our lives today. First it was President Bush, then it was the banks, then it was business, then it was the insurance company, then it was Wall Street, then it was 1% of us, and now it's the United States Congress, which of course is primarily run in a government that is primarily run by the President's own political party. And the President has taken to saying in his campaign speeches, in his State of the Union address the other day, if Congress won't act, I will. And he's begun to show that that's no idle threat, because now on top of those National Labor Relations Board actions, we have the implementation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in a way that's completely unaccountable to members of Congress for the spending. The checks and balances that were placed in our Constitution and that George Washington so respected are being eroded by the actions of this administration. And this Senate has always been the place, whether it was the Democratic Senate arguing about the appropriateness of President Bush using war powers, this Senate has always been the place that has insisted upon checks and balances and the liberty of the people as guaranteed by those checks and balances. Most recently, the President has shown disregard for possibly the best and most important role of the Senate, at least it's the best known, and that is its power of advice and consent of executive and judicial nominations as outlined in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. These actions, 4 appointments, during a period of time when the Senate, in my opinion, was not in session, or was in session, fly in the face of the principle of separation of powers, the concepts of checks and balances against an imperial president. Now let's look for a moment at the history and precedent that had to do with the appointment of these 4 individuals. The exact length is not defined in the Constitution, but according to the Congressional Research Service, quote, it appears that no president, at least in the modern era, has made an intra-session recess appointment during a recess of less than 10 days. Both parties have relied upon the adjournment clause in Article 1 of the Constitution to argue that the absolute minimum recess period would conceivably be 3 days. To be more specific, as of January of this year, January 23rd, President Obama had made 32 recess appointments, all to full-time positions. At the same point in time in his first term, President Clinton had made 9 recess appointments to full-time positions. President Bush, at about the same time, had made 35. So they all made recess appointments while the Senate was in recess. That's provided for specifically in the Constitution as something the President could do. But President Clinton never did it when the Congress was in session for less than 10 days. President Bush never did it when Congress was in recess for shorter than 11 days. And President Obama did it when we were in a period of less than 3 days. Why is that important? Well, in 2007, the current majority leader of the United States Senate, Harry Reid, decided that the Senate did not want President Bush making recess appointments. That is, making appointments while the Senate wasn't in session. So they refused, the Senate did at that time, to enter into prolonged recesses. They invented the idea of pro forma recesses every 3 days. President Bush strenuously objected to that, but he respected that. He respected the constitutional authority of the Senate under Article 1, Section 5, to determine when the Senate is in session. On November 16, 2007, Senator Reid said, quote, with the Thanksgiving break looming, this is Senator Reid, the administration has informed me that they would make several recess appointments. Now, Senator Reid didn't like the idea of recess appointments any more than we do. So he said, As a result, I am keeping the Senate in pro forma to prevent recess appointments until we get this back on track.
Has consumed 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Would you please let me know when I consume 3 more? On November 16th, Senator Reid said, as a result, I'm keeping the Senate in pro forma to prevent recess appointments until we get the process back on track. We don't need a vote in recess. We'll just be in pro forma session. We will tell the House to do the same thing. Well, Mr. President, the President is restricted, as Senator Reid indicated, by Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, which states that neither House during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the 2 houses shall be sitting. Last December, when the House and Senate agreed to adjourn, the Speaker, a Republican, and the Majority Leader here, a Democrat, agreed the 2 chambers were not going to recess, but would hold pro forma sessions for the express purpose of not going into recess, yet the President went ahead and made his appointments. This is a dangerous trend. It's a dangerous trend. The major issue before our country is the Obama economy. That is what we'll be talking about more than anything else in an election year. But liberty is also important in our country. And if the President's current actions were to stand as a precedent, the Senate may very well find that when it takes a break for lunch, when it comes back, the country has a new Supreme Court justice. Because we believe in the importance of that constitutional system, all of us on the Republican side insist on a full and complete debate on this issue. We intend to take this issue to the American people. We will file amicus curiae briefs in all of the appropriate courts, and we will take this issue to the most important court in the land, and that is the court of the American people on Election Day. I don't suggest that the President will find or even should find his relationship with Congress to be easy or simple. George Washington didn't. President Washington once came up here to discuss a treaty with senators and became so angry that he said, and these are Washington words, "I'll be damned if I go there again." Well, the separations of powers does not mean an easy distribution of powers, but it is essential to the American character. We should remember that. A short trip to Mount Vernon would remind us of that. The President's recess appointments not only show disregard for the Constitution, they show disregard for every individual American who chooses liberty over tyranny, President over king. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.